It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. The Mark Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Mark is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Mark Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Mark Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. Welcome to my listeners here on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio and Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live and the other Facebook Lives we've got running right now. If you'd like to call in and comment on the show, you're welcome to call in at 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. If you'd like to listen to some prior podcasts of the show, read my biweekly columns on Penn Live or the Western Journal or the American Thinker, or to take a look at some great merchandise, you can check out the MarkScaringiShow.com website. And you can subscribe to the Mark Scaringi Show on YouTube and follow me on Twitter at Mark Scaringi or on Facebook. And the biggest news of the day is the case involving President Trump and the whistleblower and the intense showdown between the Trump administration and Democrats in Congress. The backstory. An unnamed intelligence official apparently made a complaint reportedly involving President Trump asking Ukrainian President Zelensky, that's Volodymyr Zelensky, to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden's son, Hunter, for alleged wrongdoing while his father, Joe Biden, was vice president, and or, it's not entirely clear, to investigate possible efforts by the Democratic National Committee to collude with Ukrainians to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential elections in support of Hillary Clinton's candidacy. Now, one point to make before we kind of delve into the details of this story is no one in the media has actually read the complaint or participated or listened into the call between Trump and the Ukrainian president. So every report about the contents of the telephone call and the contents of the whistleblower complaint at this point is pure unverified speculation based upon leaks or just plain fabrications by the media. President Trump himself has warned the media. Actually, he's kind of taunted the media and encouraged them to keep reporting and keep publishing fake news stories about his call with the Ukrainian president because Trump says it's going to blow up big in the media's face in the same way the Russian collusion story did. In fact, that turned out to be a complete fabrication after 2.5 years of media reports about this alleged collusion between Trump and the Russians to interfere in the U.S. presidential election. But now we have alleged collusion between the Democrats, the Democratic National Committee, and the Ukrainians to interfere in the 2016 presidential election in support of Hillary Rodham Clinton. But with regard to the whistleblower complaint that is dominating the news cycle today, what do we know? Well, we do know that the complaint is being handled as part of the process set up by the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act. That's the ICWPA. And by the way, that act does not actually offer any protections to whistleblowers. Rather, instead, it outlines procedures for how intelligence community whistleblowers should alert their superiors as to real or perhaps perceived ethical transgressions or instances of lawlessness allegedly committed by federal authorities. Now, the Act defines these particular situations as matters of urgent concern. And if the whistleblower believes there is a matter of urgent concern that he or she has become aware of, this Act provides them the process for getting that urgent concern up the chain of command. So if a whistleblower has a complaint, they write it up, making clear it's a complaint filed under this particular act, and they submit it to their own agency's inspector general or to this broadly mandated intelligence community inspector general. Now, in this particular case involving the whistleblower who allegedly is blowing the whistle on President Trump, the complaint was submitted to the intelligence community inspector general who, now according to the statute, the whistleblower statute in question, he had 14 days to decide whether the complaint was credible. And after that, the intelligence community inspector general forwarded the complaint to the head of this particular whistleblower's agency. In this case, it's the acting director of national intelligence, Mr. Joseph McGuire. And Mr. McGuire, pursuant to the act, the Whistleblower Act, he had 7 days to provide the whistleblower complaint to the respective intelligence committees of the United States Congress. Now, in this case, Mr. McGuire, the acting director of the National Intelligence Agency, it's really not much of an agency, it's just the director of national intelligence, he refused to transfer or submit this whistleblower complaint to Congress. And thus, the fireworks have erupted between the Democratic leader of the House Intelligence Committee and the Trump administration and the intelligence community. The Democratic leader of the House Intelligence Committee is demanding that the Trump administration transmit the whistleblower complaint. The Trump administration, through its Director of National Intelligence, is refusing to do so at this point. Now, Mr. McGuire, the acting Director of National Intelligence, he is justifying his refusal to share this information with Congress due to a legal decision authored by the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Counsel. Now, Mr. McGuire's had the general counsel for the Director of National Intelligence Office write a letter to the Congress explaining his decision to withhold this whistleblower complaint from the United States Congress. Now, according to the general counsel to the Director of National Intelligence, here's why the Trump administration is not sending over the whistleblower complaint to Congress. The information within the complaint is different in kind from that involved in any past cases of which we are aware. The present complaint does not allege misconduct within the intelligence community or concern an intelligence activity subject to the authority of the DNI. Furthermore, because the complaint involves confidential and potentially privileged communications by persons outside the intelligence community, aka, or that is, President Donald Trump, the DNI, they didn't say that, that's my ad-libbing. The DNI lacks unilateral authority to transmit such materials to the intelligence committees. Therefore, the DNI determined not to transmit this confidential information to the intelligence committees. Now, the attorney for DNI cited a signing statement by then-President Bill Clinton, whose signature enacted the law in question, that the statute did not constrain the president's ability to withhold classified information from Congress. So you can see the White House, the Trump administration, is claiming that the communications between the U.S. president and the Ukrainian president are privileged and subject to executive privilege, that they're classified. The attorney for DNI also cited an Obama administration opinion in 2010 that if this bill were read to give intelligence community employees unilateral discretion to disclose classified information to Congress, it would be unconstitutional. So this fight is boiling down to the fact that the Trump administration is declaring this information is confidential, and they're not going to submit it to Congress, notwithstanding what the Whistleblower Act says. We'll talk more about Trump, the Whistleblower Act, and former Vice President Joe Biden when we return from this brief commercial break. You're listening to The Mark Scaringi Show.
Now, more of Mark Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. We're talking today about President Trump and the whistleblower, including former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter Biden. They're wrapped up in all of this. And we've gone through the Whistleblower Act in question and explained how this whistleblower complaint was filed, the process that it went through, and how it got stymied at the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and how the acting director, Mr. Joseph McGuire, apparently on the advice of the Office of Legal Counsel of the White House, has determined that it will not submit the complaint to Congress in defiance of the Whistleblower Act because, according to the administration and the DNI, the whistleblower complaint includes classified information. Now, the complaint is purportedly about a telephone call between the President of the United States and the President of Ukraine, and media reports, we haven't read the complaint, and of course we weren't privy to the telephone call itself, but media reports indicate the President of the United States was encouraging the Ukrainian president to investigate Joe Biden's son Hunter Biden and potential corruption involved in young Hunter Biden's tenure as a board member on a particular Ukrainian company. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few minutes, but first, just to kind of bring to a close this kind of tete-a-tete, or this dispute between the administration and the Democratic leaders in Congress is starting to boil over. It's dominating the news cycle over the past couple of days. Representative Adam Schiff, who is the chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, he claims, he's adamant that his committee will get a copy of that complaint. He's very angry that the DNI and the Trump administration apparently will not submit it voluntarily. Mr. Schiff has declared that something more sinister is afoot. Something more sinister is going on with President Trump and the anonymous withheld whistleblower complaint. Adam Schiff, he's of course a Democrat from California, declared that his committee would engage in a thorough investigation of the complaint come hell or high water. Now, Schiff, you'll recall, was one of the president's chief antagonists who conducted multiple hearings on Russian collusion and accused the president, without any actual factual or legal basis, of collusion and obstruction of justice. Schiff transitioned from his Russian collusion story when it blew up in his face to calls for the president's impeachment. Now he's adding this Trump Trump-Ukrainian collusion story, which I anticipate will turn out to be fake as the Trump-Russian collusion. Representative Adam Schiff also said, "We do know that the Department of Justice has been involved in the decision to withhold that information from Congress. We do not know, because we cannot get an answer to the question about whether the White House is involved in preventing this information from coming to Congress." So there's a lot to unwrap here, and the first question is, what did occur during that telephone call? Now, again, all we have are media accounts. We have no direct evidence. Nevertheless, the Wall Street Journal has recently reported, as recently as yesterday, that earlier this summer the president spoke with his Ukrainian counterpart, first to congratulate him on his electoral victory, and then during the call, Trump apparently asked the Ukrainian president, maybe about 8 times, to look into the Biden family corruption matter. And he asked whether Hunter Biden had been shielded from prosecution by then Vice President Joe Biden. So first, let's assume for the sake of argument that the Wall Street Journal article is accurate. Is what President Trump allegedly said to the Ukrainian president subject to the Whistleblower Act? Well, let's do a little legal analysis here. First, to fall within the jurisdiction of the Whistleblower Act, the matter must be an urgent concern, and the Act defines the term urgent concern, which one would posit is rather ambiguous in and of itself. I can think of lots of urgent concerns that I have on a daily basis. Nevertheless, what is an urgent concern? Here's how the Act defines it: a serious or flagrant problem. What is a serious or flagrant problem. Who knows? Abuse, violation of law. Now, I think we can understand and ascertain what a violation of law is, or a violation of an executive order. I think that's something we can understand. Or deficiency relating to the funding, administration, or operations of an intelligence activity involving classified information. Now, this is purportedly about a telephone call, which is in of itself between the president and the between our president and the Ukrainian president, that is in of itself classified. But the Whistleblower Act is looking at matters of urgent concern, a serious or flagrant problem. Who the heck knows what a flagrant problem is, or a serious problem? So, and as an aside, we can admonish our members of Congress, and while we're at it, admonish our members of the Pennsylvania General Assembly to please try to draft bills and laws clearly and cogently that use actual nouns and verbs that definitively define the thing you're trying to legislate. This is absurd. What's a serious or flagrant problem? We have no idea. Anyway, the whole definition pertains to operations of an intelligence activity involving classified information. So one could think maybe this is about leaking classified information. Maybe this is about some sort of illegal or fraudulent, it would be probably not fraudulent, it would probably be an illegal use of classified information. But anyway, that's the definition of urgent concern for a whistleblower complaint. Now, if President Trump asked the Ukrainian president 8 times over during this telephone call earlier this summer to look into the Biden family corruption matter, and if he asked the Ukrainian president whether Hunter Biden had been shielded from prosecution by then Vice President Joe Biden, does that meet the definition of a serious or flagrant problem, abuse, violation of law or executive order, or deficiency relating to the funding, administration, or operations of an intelligence activity involving classified information? No, it doesn't. The president has every right to ask a foreign power to investigate an allegation of corruption involving a U.S. politician. There's an entire public corruption unit within the United States Department of Justice, of which President Trump, by the way, is in charge of as the chief executive officer, the chief magistrate of the United States of America, of the federal government. It's entirely within the president's jurisdiction as the chief law enforcement officer of the United States of America, and, by the way, as the chief foreign policy officer of the United States of America. So it's questionable to me that this Whistleblower Act even applies to the subject matter at hand. Now, let's examine the Hunter Biden case. And this is something that the mainstream media is intentionally ignoring. I mean, how many of you have heard repeated and detailed accounts of the Hunter Biden alleged corruption involving the Ukrainian government and this Ukrainian oligarch? It's been swept under the rug. And interestingly, this whistleblower non-scandal, of course, the media is calling it a scandal, but really it's not. But the media is trying to deflect from the real allegation here of corruption by former Vice President Joe Biden. And they're trying to transform this into President Trump being corrupt. So that's the key takeaway from the show here today. If we haven't made any other valid point, that's an important one, that this entire portrayal by the media that President Trump is somehow corrupt and colluding when he talks to the Ukrainian president and says, hey, why don't you look into whether or not there was corruption involving former Vice President Joe Biden and his son getting this gig as a member of a board of a prominent Ukrainian energy company. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. but our media friends are ignoring the truth, and they're turning it into that Trump is somehow there was one media report I read this morning that Trump is somehow committing an impeachable offense through this telephone conversation. So mark my words, this will become part of the impeachment hearings that famously occurred just a few days ago over there in the House of Representatives, where Corey Lewandowski just admonished just about every Democrat who was trying to question him. But that's for another story. But let's examine the Hunter Biden case. Now, the Burisma Group is the leading private natural gas producer operating in Ukraine. It offers, this is according to Wikipedia, I think, offering a wide range of services. The company is the first and only fully integrated gas operator in Ukraine engaged in the exploration, production, processing, transportation, and final sale of what? What? Hydrocarbons. Those evil, evil hydrocarbons that are destroying the earth. We only have 10 years to live. We're all going to die because of hydrocarbons. Hunter Biden, Joe Biden's trustworthy and loyal son, was on the board of a major Ukrainian company producing hydrocarbons that are killing us. So there's a little irony there, where we have Joe Biden running for president in 2020, talking about the Green New Deal and how he's going to shut down the coal, oil, and natural gas industry. Joe Biden campaigning on shutting down the coal, oil, and natural gas industry. Thankfully, Hunter Biden is no longer on the board of Burisma that produces a heck of a lot of natural gas. Had Hunter Biden still been on the board, receiving millions of dollars from his board service, do you think Joe Biden would still be talking about shutting down all natural gas? Maybe, because Biden can only shut down natural gas in the United States. And if Biden shuts down the natural gas production in the United States, boy, Burisma would certainly do a heck of a lot better, wouldn't it? Who knows? Anyway, so, and by the way, we got to take a brief commercial break. I wasn't watching the clock. I apologize. You're listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after this.
Let's get back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is the place where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're talking about the whistleblower scandal, the Trump administration and Democratic House leaders Adam Schiff and others going head-to-head over this whistleblower complaint. Someone within some intelligence agency filing a complaint under the Whistleblower Act that purportedly involves a telephone call between the President of the United States and the Ukrainian President, where, according to the Wall Street Journal, President Trump asked the Ukrainian President about 8 times to investigate former Vice President Joe Biden and his son Hunter, and whether there was corruption involved in Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's business dealings, and Joe Biden as a vice president, his foreign diplomacy in Ukraine. It's dominating the news cycle, and we just heard a clip on the Fox News during the break where apparently vice president's on the campaign trail right now and has just former vice president, although he still thinks he's a vice president if you watch the last debate where he emphatically declared that. Former Vice President Joe Biden said that Trump should be investigated. For what? Well, Joe said Trump should be investigated for violating all norms. Now, I'm not so sure that would be a proper charge to bring against anybody. You'd have to flip through the United States Criminal Code, and if we have any lawyers listening, any prosecutors or defense attorneys, I wonder if there is the offense called violating all norms. If the President of the United States is violating all norms, then Joe Biden wants him to be prosecuted. That's just a silly, stupid comment by former Vice President Joe Biden that has no basis in law or reality. Yet it's what else is he going to say? I mean, he and his son were purportedly involved in some corruption in Ukraine. His son got rich off his appointment to the board of a natural gas company owned and controlled by a Ukrainian oligarch. In America we call them businessmen, but if they're foreigners, then our Democratic friends, if our Democratic friends don't like them, they're called oligarchs. In any event, Joe Biden not happy that our president wants the Ukrainian president to look into his past dealings. And Joe Biden also said in that clip from Fox News that Trump should be investigated for trying to intimidate a foreign leader. So is that another offense under the Crimes Code? One of our lawyer listeners will have to opine, is it a crime to intimidate a foreign leader? Now, noticeably, if that were a crime, which it obviously is not, Joe Biden could be charged. Remember, Joe Biden famously declared during some sort of policy seminar, which we'll get into later if we have time, how he intimidated the Ukrainian government to fire the prosecutor who was looking into illegality and corruption involving Burisma. And who sat on the board of Burisma? Young Hunter Biden. And Joe Biden was going to withhold billions of dollars in foreign aid to the Ukraine that it desperately needed at that particular time if the Ukrainian government did not fire that prosecutor who was looking into Burisma for alleged violations of the law and alleged corruption. Well, the Ukrainian government did as Joe Biden directed, and they fired that prosecutor, and thus Hunter Biden is living freely and in a very wealthy, he's living the high life today as a result of the interference, if you will, intimidation, if you will, by a very intimidating Vice President Joe Biden. Remember, he's the guy who took Corn Pop. He was going to take that chain to Corn Pop and commit a violent assault on that young Corn Pop at that swimming pool back in Wilmington quite some time ago. Joe Biden's a tough man. He's going to take Donald Trump behind the schoolyard or behind the shed or behind the garage or wherever. And he's gonna physically assault our president to show him that he's tougher. So we have a tough former vice president in Joe Biden who intimidated the Ukrainian government into firing the prosecutor who was investigating his son's company. So if we're going to be investigating politicians for trying to intimidate foreign leaders, you got to put Joe Biden in the blocks there. He's going to be target number one. But in any event, we're talking about how what the phone call between the President Trump and the Ukrainian president, and in my view, based upon the reports as to what was discussed in the Wall Street Journal report, it doesn't even qualify under the Whistleblower Act. And everything the president says to a foreign leader is classified anyway. It's classified information. It's subject to non-disclosure because of that. But we're investigating a little bit here. We're looking into the Hunter Biden and Burisma group. In any event, we talked about the irony of Joe Biden, the Green Warrior, wanting to end fossil fuels and hydrocarbons, and the fact that his son got rich as a member of a board of a hydrocarbon producing company in Ukraine. In any event, it was back in 2014 when Hunter Biden, the son of then Vice President Joe Biden, he managed, and remember at the time, Vice President Biden was managing U.S.-Ukrainian relations for the Obama administration. President Obama made Joe Biden his point person to manage. Remember, Barack Obama put Joe Biden on his ticket as vice presidential candidate because of Joe Biden's alleged purported extensive experience in foreign policy. And, of course, Barack Obama had none prior to running for office, so that was going to bolster the ticket. So we have Joe Biden now not being fingered by Barack Obama. President Obama says, Joe, go over there to the Ukraine and manage U.S.-Ukrainian relations. Well, that was like, Joe Biden must have seen dollar signs as soon as he was given that directive by the president, because his son Hunter was shortly thereafter appointed to the board of Burisma Holdings. Now, on the website of Burisma Holdings, Hunter Biden wrote a little blurb for the website, and he, at the time, this was back in 2014, he wrote he believed Burisma was important to the economy of Ukraine and that he would be, quote, consulting the company on matters of transparency, corporate governance and responsibility, international expansion, and other priorities, end quote. He became acting member of the board of directors on May 12th of 2014. Okay, at the same time, his father is managing U.S.-Ukrainian relations. Now, first of all, what do you think Hunter Biden knows about transparency, corporate governance and responsibility, international expansion, and other priorities? Was Hunter Biden a prominent corporate attorney? Was he a prominent energy sector attorney? Was he a prominent international lawyer? No, no, and no. Did Hunter Biden have any prior experience in the natural gas industry prior to his nomination to the board of directors of a prominent natural gas industry company? The answer, no. Did Hunter Biden have any prior experience in the overall energy industry before he was nominated to the board of Burisma, the energy company? The answer is no. Now, prior to getting onto the board, Hunter Biden was what? A D.C. lobbyist. So he's a lobbyist trading off his father's name and position as vice president. Oh, by the way, Hunter Biden also ran a hedge fund. Now, does anybody know anything about managing a hedge fund? Hunter Biden had no prior experience in investments. I mean, he wasn't even a financial analyst at Charles Schwab or H&R Block. Is that still around? I'm not sure. I mean, he had no prior investment experience of any kind, but then becomes the owner and manager of a hedge fund, gets on Air Force Two with his father, who was then vice president, flies to China, meets with the Chinese Communist Party, the men in China who run it, and comes back from that trip with a deal for he's going to manage now $1.5 billion in monies of the Chinese Communist Party that they gave to young Hunter Biden to manage in his hedge fund. So this Hunter Biden is doing really well. Why? Well, his father was the vice president, and his father worked actively to get Hunter Biden these great gigs for which he had absolutely no experience or expertise in. Okay. Anyway, after the appointment of Hunter Biden to the board was announced back in 2014, press articles raised concerns about Biden's potential conflicts of interest. CNN, stated that the Biden appointment caused a stir, given that it occurred around the same time that his father and the White House were engaged in diplomatic missions in the region to wean Ukraine off Russian energy sources. Critics argue that Hunter's work for a country promoting Ukrainian energy independence was a blatant conflict of interest. Well, sure it is. So we have Hunter Biden on the board getting rich of Burisma, a Ukrainian natural gas company. At the same time, his father, Vice President of the United States, appointed by Barack Obama, then president, to be the point man in U.S.-Ukrainian relations, Biden goes to Ukraine and says to the Ukrainian government, get off natural gas, get off Russian natural gas. Stop importing Russian natural gas. Don't be dependent on Russian natural gas. Use your own natural gas. Hey, by the way, my son Hunter, former hedge fund manager, or maybe he still was a hedge fund manager for the Chinese Communist Party. By the way, he works for Burisma. It's a natural gas company in your own country. Use Ukrainian natural gas. Now, I don't know that he said these things at the end here, but I think you're getting the point. Oops, I forgot to look at the clock again. I apologize. We got to take a brief commercial break. You're listening to the Mark Scaringi Show. Stay tuned.
Now back to the Mark Scaringi Show on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Mark Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And we're getting kind of very fine-tuned detail here. We're getting into the weeds a little bit on this Trump whistleblower scandal that's erupting all over Washington, D.C. today over the past couple of days. So I hope you're bearing with me, but there's just such a treasure trove of interesting information and facts to be gleaned from media reports and from the actual legal process itself. I've been digressing a little bit on young Hunter Biden and the $1.5 billion that he's managing from the Chinese Communist Party and the Bank of China in his hedge fund. That was back in 2011. Of course, no prior investment experience of any kind. A couple of years later, he got that through his because he flew on Air Force Two over to China with his dad, former vice president, who was vice president at the time, Joe Biden. They scored that deal. A few years later, they score another deal. Hunter Biden gets appointed to the board of Burisma, a Ukrainian natural gas company. Joe Biden, just by chance, happens to be the point person between appointed by Barack Obama, the president, to conduct and manage U.S.-Ukrainian relations. Biden goes over to Ukraine, says, hey, guys, stop buying this natural gas from Russia. Buy natural gas right here in the Ukraine. My son, by the way, is a board member and receives a nice fee from Burisma. They make natural gas right here in Ukraine. Buy Ukraine first, or put Ukraine first. That's the Biden foreign and economic policy that benefits the Biden family. So this is what's going on. Of course, at least some of the news media, and we just read a report from CNN back in the day in 2014 saying, you know what, this is a problem. This is a blatant conflict of interest, according to one of the reports by CNN, citing some of the critics of the Joe Biden, Hunter Biden effort there in the Ukraine. And so we had some media reporting back in 2015 about this potential conflict of interest there. And then the big story is just a couple of years ago, Joe Biden, who's now retired, no longer vice president, and Joe, we love crazy Uncle Joe. Joe Biden must be the funnest guy at any party. He's half with it, half out of it. Says all kinds of crazy things, launches into these personal stories and anecdotes, forgetting forgetting most of the facts, and it must be a lot of fun. But he's at this seminar, and he's bragging to those who were there about how he basically strong-armed Ukraine into firing his top prosecutor. Now, these are in his own words, with the video cameras rolling, and you got to Google it. Joe Biden described how he threatened Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko in March of 2016 that the Obama administration would pull $1 billion in U.S. loan guarantees, sending the former Soviet republic toward insolvency if it didn't immediately fire Prosecutor General Viktor Shoikin. And Biden said, and I quote, I said, "You're not getting that billion. I'm going to be leaving here," and I think it was about 6 hours. I looked at them and I said, "I'm telling you, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If that prosecutor is not fired, you're not getting the money." Biden recalled telling Poroshenko. And then Biden goes on, he says, "Well, son of a bitch, he got fired, and they put in place someone who was solid at the time." Okay, so that's the story told by Joe Biden when he was bragging about how he intimidated a foreign leader into firing the chief prosecutor of that country. And now today, Joe Biden is on the record telling the media just today, you heard it in the Fox News soundbite, that Trump should be investigated for intimidating foreign leaders. But my goodness, Joe Biden is the ultimate intimidator of foreign leaders. He threatened to withhold $1 billion in U.S. loan guarantees, which we shouldn't have been giving any loan guarantees to the Ukrainian government at the time anyway. But nevertheless, Obama, he just gives our money, gives billions here, gives billions there. Joe's over there saying, "You're not getting the billion unless you fire the chief prosecutor of your country." I don't like him, Joe Biden says. "Get rid of him or no money for you." So they fire him. I guess Joe Biden gives him the $1 billion, and everybody lives happily ever after because that chief prosecutor, he was leading a wide-ranging corruption probe into what company? Burisma Holdings. And whom did Burisma Holdings employ? A young man, a young lawyer named Hunter Biden, a board member and consultant who was making quite a pretty penny in Ukrainian money. What is Ukrainian money? Are they rubles or what are they? We'll have to have some currency expert call us. U.S. banking records show Hunter Biden's American-based firm called Rosemont Seneca Partners LLC received regular transfers into one of its accounts, usually more than $166,000 a month from Burisma from the spring of 2014 through the fall of 2015. $166,000 a month was being funneled into young Hunter Biden's LLC. Between April of 2014 and October of 2015, more than $3 million was paid out of Burisma accounts into young Hunter Biden's account. These are according to financial records, by the way, placed in federal court files in Manhattan in New York in an unrelated case against young Hunter Biden's partner, Mr. Archer. All of these payments to Hunter Biden were made during a period in which Vice President Joe Biden was the main U.S. official dealing with Ukraine. Ukraine's chief prosecutor, Mr. Shoikin, whom Joe Biden had fired, told John Solomon of The Hill that before he was fired as general prosecutor, he had made specific plans for the investigation that, quote, included interrogations and other crime investigation procedures into all members of the executive board of Burisma, including who? Hunter Biden. So at the time, Joe Biden said to the Ukrainian president, you fire that chief prosecutor or I'm not giving you $1 billion in U.S. taxpayer dollars. You fire him. At that time, Mr. Shoikin, the chief prosecutor, had plans to interrogate and use other crime investigation procedures against young Hunter Biden. Wow. Is that evidence of corruption? My goodness, it seems that it is. And if you were the President of the United States today, if you are the chief law enforcement officer of these United States, if you are the titular head or the nominal head of the United States Department of Justice, wouldn't you be interested in maybe doing a little investigation into whether or not the former Vice President of the United States threatened to withhold $1 billion in U.S. taxpayer dollars to a Ukrainian government if that government did not fire its chief prosecutor who was, at that time, investigating your son under its criminal investigatory powers? Whew. I think there's a little there, don't you? At least there's a little there enough to justify perhaps an investigation. Well, by the way, what happened to that investigation after Mr. Shoikin was fired at the threat request of Joe Biden? Most of the general prosecutor's investigative work on Burisma ultimately just kind of went away. There was one part, the most prominent part of the Burisma case was transferred to a different Ukrainian agency that was closely aligned with the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. Remember, at the time, Barack Obama's president, Joe Biden's vice president. Joe Biden's in charge of relationships between the U.S. and Ukraine. That the most prominent part of the Burisma case was transferred to the Ukrainian agency closely aligned with the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. And according to the case file, it was then what? Closed. Well, there we have quite a bit of evidence of possible corruption involving the former Vice President of the United States. And it is entirely legal and proper and appropriate for the current President of the United States. And by the way, we haven't even gotten into the allegations of the Democratic National Committee attempting to encourage the Ukrainian government to do some dirty work for it in the campaign back in 2016 in support of Hillary Clinton's candidacy. We know the Democratic National Committee paid Hillary Clinton, and the DNC paid a foreign agent to essentially fabricate false evidence against Donald Trump involving Russians. And that blew up in their faces ultimately. And now we have evidence that they were doing the same thing with Ukrainians, who, according to Americans, are just about as close to Russians as you get anyway. Well, that's about all the time we have today for the Mark Scaringi Show. I want to thank you for listening, and thank you for bearing with me as we kind of got into the weeds on this critical story that's breaking all over the country today. That's about all the time we have. Thanks for listening.